Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this third edition of retrospective prospective webinar series from Indic Academy. I'm really happy and excited to present Professor Michel Danino today. Hello, Professor. We have three sessions today. We have four panelists who will be in dialogue with Professor Danino. Before we start the session today, I'd like to say a few words. First of all, I'd like to dedicate this event from Indic Academy to the memory of the Indian soldiers who have given up their lives in protecting our country and our freedoms. In memory of their sacrifice, we would like to start the event today with a small song commemorating them. I'd like to request Isha and Trisha to please turn on their microphone and sing.
मेरे वतन के लोगों जरा आँख में भर लो पानी जो शहीद हुए हैं उनकी जरा याद करो कुर्बानी मेरे वतन के लोगों जरा आँख में भर लो पानी जो शहीद हुए हैं उनकी जरा याद करो कुर्बानी जब घायल हुआ हिमालय खतरे में पड़ी आजादी जब तक थी सांस लड़े वो जब तक थी सांस लड़े वो फिर अपनी लाश बिछा दी जमीन पे धर कर माता सो गए अमर बलिदानी जो शहीद हुए हैं उनकी जरा याद करो कुर्बानी ऐ मेरे वतन के लोगों जरा आँख में भर लो पानी जो शहीद हुए हैं उनकी जरा याद करो कुर्बानी जो शहीद हुए हैं उनकी जरा याद करो कुर्बानी.
Thank you, Trisha and Isha. I'd request you to now switch off the video. Welcome back, everyone. What is a civilization without protection? No matter what could be the greatest cultural and intellectual achievements of a civilization, without Raksha, it doesn't take any time for it to disappear. Yeah, even from memories. For the past 1,000 years, we have faced cultural and even physical destruction of all sorts. The last 200 years, we have faced intellectual and cultural destruction as well. And we are in interesting times at this time. After 50, 60 years after independence, this is the time there is some sign of a cultural civilizational revival. And there are a lot of people who are playing a great role in this. And I'm proud to present Professor Michel Danino is one of the important people who is also playing a role in this. It was interesting. I saw a small a post by my friend Dr. Nimbalkar, a friend of his actually posted on his wall, saying, "Don't we need an Indian, to lead the Rebirth?" So that's when I suddenly realized that, oh, people could actually think Michel may not be Indian. It didn't even occur to me because in all my interactions with him so far, he's so Indian, more Indian than, any other Indian, many other Indians I've seen, that, it didn't even occur to me that people may think, is Michel even Indian? Of course, Michel is Indian. He's been living in India from the age of 21 in 1977 when he moved to India. I will introduce him and other panelists a little later, but I'd request Sri Harikiran Vadlamani Garu, the founder of Indic Academy, to say a few words about Indic Academy.
Namaste. Srinivas, welcome all to this third in the series of retrospective, prospective, and legacy partnerships that we are building with various scholars. This is a third edition, and there is a certain sense of a different kind of satisfaction with this approach that we are taking of focusing on a few scholars and looking at how they built their body of work and looking at what is that they want to do, what is it that they want to do, and seeing how we can partner with them. And when I first met Michel, probably at 4 to 5 years back, and we've been in touch regularly, always exploring things to do. His Indic Knowledge Systems course, which monumental work that he has done for CBSE, we wanted to scale it up. We partnered with Chinmaya Institute and did a teacher training program. And since then, it's been, it's just one of the things. We have done so many things in Indic Academy, but the one desire that is unfulfilled is how do I take Michel's work and scale it up? Because I was speaking to him the other day and I was telling that he's a sort of a synthesizer. The way, without any ego, he brings in all these scholars and he synthesizes, given the body of work that we have. We are all trying to protect something, preserve something, but he has put together this body of work in such a beautiful manner that it's very sad. I feel sad that this government has not done anything to build this work and take it forward. And this is something which I'm personally very passionate about. Hopefully, every student, every school student would look at learning this his syllabus, and that's the dream that we have. And over the period of next 4 hours, you will all discover the kind of work that he has done and the beautiful curation that Srinivas has done in terms of his influence on Aurobindo and his work from then on. I welcome you all, and I request all of you, the whole purpose of this series is that we must all reach out to such venerable rishis, their modern day rishis. We should reach out to them and see how we can serve them, how we can help them, how we can assist them, and how we can carry on their legacy. That is the key, how we can carry on this legacy. We need to have a school, a Michel Danino school in all these universities to see that intellect, that power of that intellect carrying on generations to generations. This is the whole purpose of this series. And I request all of you to listen to this webinar with Shraddha and understand how a person who has come from France in 77, how he has embraced this civilization and how he has taken it forward. These words, I once again welcome you. Thank you so much, Srinivas, for a wonderful work that you're doing.
Thank you, Harikiran Garu. Welcome, Vipul. You joined a little late, but you're here. We're glad. So today we have three sessions with Professor Danino. The first session is with Dr. Pingali Gopal. Dr. Pingali Gopal is a pediatric surgeon. He's a top pediatric surgeon from Warangal in Telangana. He is one of the most prolific writers that I have actually met in recent times. He has great interest in Indian intellectual heritage. Of course, he has launched his own studies, very recently. But he would probably put several humanities professors to shame in the depth of learning that he has acquired, in Indian intellectual achievements. I'm really glad that he is here with us today, and he will be talking to Professor Danino in the first session. In the second session, we have Michel Agarwal, a luminary himself, joining us all the way from Minnesota. It's very early in the morning, 6 a.m. in the morning. Thank you very much, Vishal, for joining us so early in the morning. We are very, very happy to see you on this very important webinar. Vishal is a role model for me. He is probably one of the greatest activists that I have seen, who is equally a great intellectual as well. His learning is mind-boggling. His collection of books, whether physical copies or virtual copies, is probably is enormous. And I know many scholars themselves depend on him, for many references. His contributions to Hindu activism in the U.S., specifically in Minnesota, is very, very well known. He has written several books. And he's a very well-known figure, especially in the rebuttals to Aryan invasion theory and related subject. Very welcome, a very warm welcome to you, Vishal. Thank you very much for being here today. We also have today Mana Apurva Shah and Vipul Kochar here with us. Mana Apurva Shah, she is a faculty from IIT Gandhinagar in the Humanities and Social Sciences department since 2017. Before that, she was a faculty at LD Institute of Indology in Ahmedabad. She is currently pursuing her PhD from Jain Vishwa Bharati University in Rajasthan. Her interests are in Sanskrit and Prakrit grammar, Jain, Kavya and Strotra literature, and manuscriptology. She is working with Professor Danino at IIT Gandhinagar, and Professor Danino thought she would be a good person to actually be in dialogue to talk about the Indic knowledge systems and the practices and traditions. Welcome to you, Manaji. And we also have here Vipul Kochar. Vipulji, if you can. Jai Shri Ram. So Vipulji is Indic Academy's national convener. He is an entrepreneur. He runs a company. It's a software testing company. He's a well-acknowledged expert in software testing methodologies. He's an international speaker. He's an international trainer. And he's one of the most enthusiastic activists that I've seen. And he's the only expert that I know of on Indian mangoes. Vipulji is a great follower of Professor R.D. Ranade's philosophy and works, and he has a lot to say. And he has been very closely associated with Professor Michel Danino for a long time, and Professor Danino wanted him to be part of the third session. With this, I'd like to say a few words about Professor Danino before we start with the first session with Pingali Gopalji. Professor Danino, or Michel, he is a very important figure in the modern Indian efforts towards a self-understanding from a civilizational perspective, from an archaeological, historical perspective specifically. Of course, he has written books on the cultural aspects as well, but his contribution to the historical aspect, of our rebirth and revival is extremely important. His book, everybody knows, on the trail of the Saraswati, the lost river, um, published by Penguin in 2010, is one of the most important books, which has actually brought together all the evidence related to River Saraswati and its very important role in dismantling of the Aryan issue into a single place in a very scholarly manner. Of course, as he himself mentions in his book, it is known from 19th century that the specific dried bed that we see today is actually Saraswati River in the northeast of India. But he actually brings together all the evidence into a single book, and he marshals that in a very scholarly fashion, along with a lot more evidence which relates to meteorology, paleoclimatology, and other archaeological aspects in his book. He was born in 1977. He arrived in India in 1977.
It was
So
it was a second birth.
It was a second birth. So I think, it's quite appropriate that I actually said it that way. So he arrived in India at Auroville in 1977 when he was 21. From his teenage, he was really drawn to India, and he arrived in Pondicherry. He was initially involved in their conservation works, and also he did a lot of translations from French to English of works related to the mother and also Sri Aurobindo. Later on in 1996, when he published his first book on the Aryan invasion theory, the book, The Invasion That Never Was, a very well-known book. It was probably one of the first books which brought together all the evidence in all the various fields where evidence exists, which disproves the Aryan invasion theory. This book again was published in 2000 in an expanded version, and it very soon ran out of print. I think it went into several prints. I think a French version was also published by a professor in 2006. And of course, in 2010, The Lost River, the most famous book of his. And then in 2011, he has written Indian Culture and India's Future. Now, there are many other books that he has written. He has edited, many articles that he has written for journals, newspapers. But in recent times, the videos that he has produced for IIT Kanpur have become very, very famous. The Indian Indian civilizational knowledge series. I myself have learned a lot from those videos, and I have shared those videos myself with a lot of people. And what is the most important, for the contemporary era is his work that he has done on preparing the syllabus and material for Indic Knowledge Traditions and Practices course, which he has developed for the CBSE. And he has done a lot more, and he continues to do a lot more in documenting these various Indian knowledge practices and traditions. We will learn more about that in the third session. So with that, I'd like to request Professor Danino to just say a few words, and Dr. Pingali Gopal to start the first session. Thank you very much. Before that, I'd like to say just 2 words. The format of this would, if anybody has questions, please use the Q&A module at the bottom of your screens to type the questions. You can always use the chat to post your comments, but it will be very difficult for me to search for questions in the chat window. So if you have any specific questions, for the panel today, please post in the Q&A module. And at the end of the session, I will ask questions which I feel I can ask in the time that is available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Gopal, and Srinivas has been very kind to me those words originate from his friendship, those adjectives which he used about me. I'm a big fan and admirer of Michel Danino, and so this is the first time for me. So if I start blabbering or I start sounding incoherent, please pardon me. On a little personal note, I would like to begin that I represent basically a typical Indian urban educated, uh, English medium, convent educated Indian who was cruising around a well chosen personal life and a well chosen professional life, settled in life, and having some kind of a mixed idea about India, uh, negative as well as positive, thanks to the education system I had and the readings which I was exposed to all around was more negative. But basically, I knew that there was something great in the Indian past. We had a great heritage, we had a great civilization. But but when I looked at the so-called caste problems, religion frictions, the issues with secularism, corruption, politics, so these kind of things kind of disturbed me, and I kind of got a very not a very positive picture about my country. And this was a typical state which I had, and at the age of 40, I mean, very late in my life, I would say, Swami Vivekananda's 9 volumes, they hit me, they hit me with force, which kind of completely altered my perception about what it is all about. It is an India which was never told to me, and whether I don't know what it was, but that's how it was. And then I started looking around different people, different authors, academics, intellectuals in what I would term as a non-left wing. It's not, I wouldn't call it right wing or anything, but it's a non-left narrative, a non-dominant narrative, which kind of gave a completely different picture, an alternative picture of India. And I think in my personal view, Michel Danino stands in the top 5 of those academics and intellectuals. And my tryst with him began with this book, which is The Lost River, in which he completely blows up the Aryan invasion theory. He establishes the antiquity of Indian civilization of more than 8,000 to 10,000 years before present. And then he kind of establishes in a very methodical fashion the existence of the river Saraswati and how important it is to our collective psyche. The second book, which I would really recommend everybody to actually go through, to read, is Indian Culture and India's Future. This is a phenomenal book, which is, I think, which should be on the table of every Indian school-going student and college-going student. And each one should not buy 1 copy, but 10 copies to gift India to people they love. I'm not getting a commission here, but I think I'm just a big fan of that book. And what I'm going to talk about today is this particular book, which is Sri Aurobindo, his latest offering, and India's Rebirth. This is his latest this book, which is meant for popular consumption. And in this book, he kind of, in a very phenomenal manner, Sri Aurobindo is a forgotten hero, and he puts him back on the pedestal and shows how relevant Aurobindo is to the present scenario in India. So let me begin with this very personal note. After this personal note to Professor Danino, how and when exactly you had your calling from Sri Aurobindo and the mother, and what do they mean to you, and how did it happen that a young guy at the ripe old age of 21 suddenly decides to shift from France to India?
Thank you, Dr. Gopal. And first of all, I should thank Harikiranji and Srinivas for their very kind invitation. I felt very awkward when they asked me to steer this event about retrospective and prospective contributions of mine. I felt a bit out of place in this scheme, but anyhow, and especially as I warned them, in fact, I told them that after the event with Vishwa and Jaideep the other day, this might be a bit of an anticlimax, and because my contribution is not at the same level, and they were so brilliant, and they're doing such fundamental work that I'm not sure. Anyhow, I'm not trying to compare anything, but I would like to, in this event today, I would like to try to convey not only what have been my central concerns, and this I'm going to answer your question very shortly, Dr. Gopal, but also the way I try to contribute. And it's necessarily a very limited and very imperfect contribution, because let's not forget that the challenges for this reawakening of India, which Srinivas was referring to, are absolutely enormous. India is such a complex, endlessly complicated, endlessly challenged nation and civilization that we always feel we are just, what we do is just, as I call it, a drop in the Indian Ocean. So drop after drop after drop, nobody knows ultimately what the result can be, and the result doesn't belong to us. It's a very long drawn out work, and I think the result will be seen by future generations. I do not know in our lifetime what we will get to see, but there are changes, of course, and I agree with you, Srinivas, that there are positive signs of awakening, no doubt. I have seen them. In fact, I would like to correct you slightly, Dr. Gopal. This book which you showed had a first edition long back, and I just realized it was 27 years ago. So 1993, this was the first edition. It ran into another two and large editions, and what you showed now, which was published by Rupa 2 years ago, is actually another enlarged edition, which they chose for commercial reasons to present as a new book. It's not completely a new book. There are lots of new things in it, but it takes off from that old edition. So 27 years is a fairly long stretch of time, during which, and of course it started a bit earlier, during which I've been at work. And yes, I have seen a lot of positive signs, responses, very encouraging comments, but it still remains a drop in the ocean at the end of the day. And we will have to take stock in another maybe 27 years to decide what the scene, how far the scene has changed. The challenges are enormous. I am fond of saying that I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. So in the short term, I think that India is going to live very, very hard times. The present circumstances of today are just one of the many manifestations. We have taken so many wrong decisions as a modern nation, and even much earlier, that it's not going to be easy to forge a new nation, a new mind, a new national mind out of the present times. So to come back to your question, Dr. Gopal, you see, my quest started very early, and it started ironically at the educational level when I was going to school in France. And I was just wondering what's the meaning of all this. And one thing which I found very unacceptable, shocking, is that nothing in what we learned at school, and you know, the French school system was pretty good in those days. It was certainly better than what we have today in India. Nothing of what we learned gave us the meaning of life and what we're doing here and what we are supposed to do with this life. This was never part of the learning we were imparted, and therefore what was the use of that learning? So that was my initial question as a very young child, 6, 7 years old. And you know, as a teenager, I started reading a lot of things and looking at whatever came my way. And you know that France is a very rich nation in terms of intellectual activity, and there have been a lot of great intellectuals, but whoever I explored a little bit, and probably my explorations were superficial, but nevertheless, no one could really satisfy me. And one day, when I was in fact in Israel during a holiday, I started contacting, and I was just 15, some, Asian wisdom, as it is called, through some very insignificant publications. But then when I returned to France, I started exploring more systematically, and I very soon came upon the great Indian masters, like Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Ramana Maharshi, and several others, who were luckily available in French, though I could already read quite a bit of English, but they were available in French. And for reasons which, are not rational, so I cannot put them to you in a coherent manner, when I came upon Sri Aurobindo, I thought that this was really what I was after. His message, his method was significantly different from, let us say, the traditional lines of Indian wisdom. So in a way, he starts from that tradition, but in another way, he does not quite belong to it, because he created his own new school of thought and new vision. And I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it, but I decided that this was what I was interested in. So this was by the age of 16 or so, 16 to 17. And then I decided that if that is the case, there's no point living in France, because if I was living in France and I was, was going to do engineering studies, and I would have had no difficulty acquiring a good, stature in life. But this would remain a kind of a, this central thing which I was after would remain a kind of a hobby. It would not be my main preoccupation, and I wanted it to be that. So there was an attraction to Sri Aurobindo, there was an attraction to India, there was an attraction to putting all of this at the center of my life. And so I started, looking for opportunities to go to India right from the age of 17, but it didn't happen. I mean, I'll cut a long story short. It didn't happen until I was 21, and then I had a chance to go to Auroville. I was supposed to be there only for holidays, and then I would return after completing. I had another 1 year to go for my engineering studies, which are 5 years in France, where at least at the time. But then circumstances decided that things would happen differently, and that I didn't have to go back to France. So I changed my plans, and I decided to remain in India right there. So you can imagine, 1977, India was such a completely different place from what it is today. We were in Auroville, in that, in what is called an international township or international community, but in those days it was just a few scattered huts and tiny hamlets on a huge red landscape, half desert. There was not a single telephone there. If you wanted to make a phone call, you had to pedal down to Pondicherry, 8 kilometers away, and book a trunk call and sit for a couple of hours and wait for your turn to come. So, it was a different, there were hardly any cars in the streets, more cycles than cars, more bullock carts than cars. So it was a very different India, and I'm glad I knew it, because today's India sometimes, can be a little noisy, a little too polluted, and so on. So this was very different. And well, then I started doing various kinds of things, but soon I started working on the works of the mother. There was a great document which she recorded in French, which is called Mother's Agenda in English. That was a kind of diary of her own experiences in this line of special yoga that Sri Aurobindo pioneered. And this is a very important document to my mind, very crucial to the future evolution of humanity. And I was privileged to do most of the translation of those 13 volumes, pretty massive volumes. And this, of course, occupied a number of years. There were many other things, but since I don't want to bore my audience, and we should have a little bit of conversation, my interest in understanding India never flagged, and I wanted to, even way back in France, I was reading books about Indian civilization and trying to understand, but of course it was very superficial. So my entry into Indian civilization was really through Sri Aurobindo, because not only he did his own work, established his own path of exploration, discovery, and so on. But he also, right from his own young age and all the way to his passing in 1950, he was also very concerned with India, the destiny of India, and what were going to be the tools of this rebirth. You know that this is a term that he uses, rebirth, resurgence. He uses it all the time. And then he wrote a fundamental book, which initially was published as The Foundations of Indian Culture, which was written between 1916 and 1918, something like that. It's now available under a different title, unfortunately, which is The Renaissance in India, named after some of its essays. So there he gave, beautifully, and he was writing this book, people do not realize the kind of very, very difficult conditions under which he was working when he had just taken refuge in Pondicherry after completing his, period of active freedom fighter in first Gujarat and then Bengal, and then reaching Pondicherry in 1910. It's actually wrong to say that he took refuge in Pondicherry, because that was not what happened. What happened is that he received what he called an adesh, a divine command, to go to Chandranagar and from there further on to Pondicherry, at a time when the British were about to deport him, because they had been targeting him for a long time. They jailed him for a year during the famous Alipore bomb case. But they could not find a way to silence him until they passed draconian laws that allowed them to deport activists without any further, judicial procedure. So when this became clear, he had this inner command to move out of the scene. It was not something he decided himself. So he reached Pondicherry and had tremendous difficulty establishing himself with a small group of faithful former co-revolutionaries, mostly from Bengal, then a few joined from Gujarat, and then of course the circle grew more and more, especially after the mother joined him from France. So then he was writing all these books, especially during the 1914 to 1921 period, where he published a monthly journal called Arya, and he was working with nothing. He had no library, he had no references, he had nobody to consult. He was almost writing exclusively from memory, and with sometimes a few books he could gather with great difficulty. He was in total penury. It was rupee by rupee that his little group was able to survive. He had a little local help from a few people from Pondicherry, Tamil Nadu, and occasionally old friends from Bengal. It was a very difficult period. But this book, The Foundations of Indian Culture, or Renaissance in India, was fundamental to my understanding of India. And, it kind of immediately connects you to what is the core of that civilization. And the main message is very simple, and we all know it, because he was not the first to say it, because Swami Vivekananda had basically said something very similar. And the main message is that the core of Indian civilization rests on certain fundamental spiritual experiences, values, and strengths. And this is what carried India through her checkered destiny. And this is what can still carry India, despite all the appearances that those values, those strengths have receded in the background, are not relevant to a modern nation that has to build technology and modern living, etc., etc. So despite all this glittering appearance, and not so glittering, unfortunately, there remains this deep down conviction that we're going to have to return always to this foundation of what Indian civilization has been. So that's his message in a nutshell. And I just want, before, Dr. Gopal, before I give you the voice back, I want to read 3 little passages from this book, very different passages. And one is 1918, where it's very brief. I mean, I'm just reading the beginning, December 1918. It's part of this book, The Renaissance in India. And he writes, you have to understand this is the end of World War the First World War, where Europe is totally questioning herself, has lost her way. And he writes, in the stupendous rush of change which is coming on the human world as a result of the present tornado of upheaval, ancient India's culture, attacked by European modernism, we are of course still deep in the colonial age, overpowered in the material field, betrayed by the indifference of her children, and this is something that we have to keep in mind always, betrayed by the indifference of her children. So he's not putting the whole blame on the British or on Europe. He's also telling Indians, look at yourselves, look at what you are neglecting. So ancient India's culture may perish forever along with the soul of the nation that holds it in its keeping. And then he goes on about the destiny of India, which rests basically on the fact whether we will find that soul again and we will be able to nurture it or not. I'm jumping to, now this was 1918, and I'm jumping to 1950, I think. Yes, no, it's 1948. So 1948, 2 years before he passed away, he was conferred a prize by the Andhra University. And it was, in those days, a very prestigious prize, and he was invited to come to Hyderabad to receive it. It was called the Sir Chattamunchi Ramalinga Reddy National Prize. Of course, he did not go there, so it was bestowed in absentia, but he sent a message. And I'm just going to read the concluding part of that message in 1948, which is an echo of what he wrote in 1918. And he says that if India, I'm skipping the beginning, if India becomes just a modern nation, successful, modern, industrialized, commercial, rich, prosperous nation, he says, then ancient India and her spirit might disappear altogether. And we would only have one more nation like others, and that would be a real gain neither for the world nor for us. There is a question whether she may prosper more harmlessly in the outward life, yet lose altogether her richly massed and firmly held spiritual experience and knowledge. It would be a tragic irony of fate if India were to throw away her spiritual heritage at the very moment when in the rest of the world there is more and more a turning towards her for spiritual help and a saving light. This must not and will surely not happen, but it cannot be said that the danger is not here. You see how precisely he has diagnosed the whole conflict. There are indeed other numerous and difficult problems that face this country or will very soon face it. No doubt we will win through, but we must not disguise from ourselves the fact that after these long years of subjection and its cramping and impairing effects, a great inner as well as outer liberation. I repeat, a great inner as well as outer liberation and change. A vast inner and outer progress is needed if we are to fulfill India's true destiny. So you see the conditions he set, a vast inner and outer progress. I don't know whether we have done this or to what extent. And the last excerpt, very brief, I want to read, is topical. It shows you that people who are supposedly spiritual figures, and you know, he has been given all these labels, Maharshi, mystic, saint, and whatnot. And they're supposed to be disconnected from life, right? They are in their spiritual world. Well, not at all. They are usually the ones who can see the present situation more acutely, sharply, and this is an example. He writes in 1950 to a disciple who is trying to make sense of the complex post-World War II situation. What were the main forces at work? And you had the Soviet Union rising, China rising, Europe was still in a very bad shape, etc. So this is his diagnostic. And he says in Asia, this is at the end of a long analysis, in Asia, a more perilous situation has arisen, standing sharply across the way to any possibility of a continental unity of the peoples in this part of the world. In the emergence of communist China, this creates a gigantic bloc which could easily englobe the whole of Northern Asia in a combination between two enormous communist powers, Russia and China, and would overshadow with the threat of absorption Southwestern Asia and Tibet, and might be pushed to overrun all up to the whole frontier of India, menacing her security and that of Western Asia with the possibility of an invasion. He's talking about a possible invasion of India by China, and an overrunning and subjection by penetration or even by overwhelming military force to an unwanted ideology, political and social institutions, and dominance of this militant mass of communism whose push might easily prove irresistible. He wrote this 6 months before the Chinese invasion of Tibet, and he mentioned Tibet as you heard. In any case, the continent would be divided between two huge blocs which might enter into active mutual opposition, and the possibility of a stupendous world conflict would arise, dwarfing anything previously experienced. So this is just to show that he was quite following, and there are many, many other examples in this book, the world circumstances and the complexities of the destiny of nations. I think I've spoken enough. Dr. Gopal, would you like to take over?
No, I'm just flabbergasted with all that which you had to say about Sri Aurobindo. I think this would motivate a lot of people to explore Sri Aurobindo and Michel Danino himself, his works. And this is phenomenal because I read that book twice, your book on Aurobindo's articles. And the way
and you kindly reviewed it, and you
I did review it. Yeah, but it was a kind of but the kind of manner in which you put in a chronological order, which gave a very clear-cut picture of his life itself, and also his very clear-cut vision he had about India, was something which was in my teenage daughter's words, you know, mind-boggling and awesome. So that was something which was phenomenal. There are a lot of questions. I think Aurobindo can take a whole day, but he's kind of almost obliterated from public conscience, which was a result of some factors which I think we should really go into. But in our schooling days, we hardly knew about Aurobindo except some vague figure, some spiritual figure in Pondicherry. And after reading your essays, it was a good primer to understand. interestingly, he rejected both the parliamentary form of European democracy, and he also rejected the communistic model of Russia and China. So what he was saying an ideal India, what was he looking at? Was it an enlightened monarchy, which was in the past, which all the scriptures kind of gave importance to? So what was his idea about an ideal nation, an ideal governance, and an ideal political system? Because he was very much involved in these kind of questions.
Absolutely, you're right. What he said throughout, and there are many quotations, many excerpts in this book, this answering your question. What he said throughout is very simply that India should not build her future independence on the colonial, on the basis of the colonial system, but should look for new foundations which would draw inspiration from the past and from the you know what existed in the past. And he was referring in particular to the democratic traditions, ancient democratic traditions of India, like the old assembly systems which existed at several levels in ancient India. And Shomino has studied Indian history quite in depth. Of course, he didn't have all the material we would have today, but he even taught Indian history when he was in the Bengal National College from 1906 onward for a couple of years. So he was quite aware of Indian history, and he could see that, yes, there was monarchy, but there were also very strong democratic structures which were peculiar to India, where self-governance was actually preferred over imposition from the top. For example, villages were very largely self-governing units, and guilds, you know, of very powerful guilds of traders and craftsmen and agriculturists were also very largely self-governing units. So there was always this spirit in ancient India that the monarch is not an absolute monarch. Absolute monarchy was a European concept much later in the Middle Ages. What he said basically, he was not dogmatic. He never formulated a precise scheme, but he said we have to build our own foundations and not go for the European parliamentary system, which he said, I think, would make us a doomed nation, India. And he could see all the divisiveness that was going to come with it. He said it's fine for Europe and for small nations in particular. Even large nations in Europe have struggled and lost a lot of time and resources. But for small nations, it's fine, he said. Not for India. It's not suited to India. And what happened after independence is just the opposite. Independent India never questioned the colonial machinery. It took up, the Westminster form of democracy, didn't discuss it. It took up the British, colonial machinery in administration, in the economic structures, judicial structures, penitentiary structures, all the legal systems, and as we will discuss later today, the educational system. Everything was taken absolutely with hardly, just cosmetic changes, and therefore. And he was not the only one. As I said, Swami Vivekananda had already given such warnings that we should rebuild India on new foundations. Gandhi, in his own way, though his vision was fairly different from Sri Aurobindo's, also wanted India to, at least at a social level, he did emphasize the village as the building block for future India. And a lot of other thinkers also, Tilak, if you read some of his writings, for example, everybody said we have to build a new India. That was the spirit during the freedom movement. The whole idea of achieving independence was to build a new India. And this is what precisely did not happen. So we can always say that, well, India progressed a little economically and so on, but the progress was slow as we know it, and it came at a great cost of immense corruption, immense political division, and therefore waste of resources. and diversion of resources. So we cannot be, happy with this 70 plus year trajectory. So this was basically. So he did say some few more things about the assembly systems, but he was not dogmatic about them. So I think if he was commenting today, he might say something. He might put things differently. But there are enough clues in this book about how. And I want to answer your other question, Dr. Gopal, that it was not a question; it was an observation, which is, why is Sri Aurobindo so poorly known and so poorly exposed in India? And I've thought about it quite a bit. I think there are two reasons. One was that he was extremely discreet. He never wanted to draw attention to himself. He absolutely never wanted a cult in his name. When he was leading the freedom movement in Bengal and closely collaborating with Tilak and a number of secret societies in Gujarat, in Maharashtra, in Bengal, he was completely in the background. Hardly anybody knew, his leading role. It's only after the British prosecuted him and for the Bande Mataram case, first of all, a sedition case which failed, and then in the Aleppo bomb case that he, became well known and prominent for a brief while. So that was, first of all, his temperament. And even in Pondicherry, he did not, though he wrote a lot, he was pressured by his disciples to put his monthly writings into book form. And he was actually not very, very keen on it. He did do it for a number of books, but many books he left unrevised, and they were actually published after his lifetime. And later on, we will discuss his Secret of the Veda in the second session, which unfortunately he never got to revising as he wanted to do. So he used to say, that it doesn't matter. His work will be established on different foundations and not through books, not through propaganda. So that was his temperament. Plus the fact that he also chose to, depart from Indian tradition in many ways. He was highly critical of Hinduism, the condition of Hinduism in his days. He called it the Hinduism of the kitchen, where we pay far more attention to food and habits and rituals and, small customs, and not enough to the central truths and strengths of Hinduism. So that's what he was interested in. But he also departed in the traditional interpretations of the Veda, of Vedanta, and so on, and created his own school of thought and practice. So perhaps all of this together combined, and the fact also that he wrote in very high-flown English, which was apparently difficult for a number of people. I've heard many people complain about his English and they find it difficult, especially his very long sentences. I have an advantage here because in French we have even much longer sentences than all those he uses. So we are used to long sentences. It doesn't matter. So these are a number of reasons, and especially his desire not to be in front. But it's a pity, and that was one motivation for this first edition, that we wanted, and this is not about his philosophy, it's not about his yoga, it's not about his practice, it's about his vision of India. And that's what we wanted Indians to be aware of. And still, there's a long way to go in this.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Srinivas is actually throwing bullets at me to kind of end this session. We don't have much time left. One question I would like to ask you at the very end, actually, that the issues which are kind of teasing our society today, nationalism, patriotism, secularism, these are the issues which are kind of big issues today in contemporary India. So what were Aurobindo's thoughts on this, and what do you feel about this?
So here, I think I would like to make, Srinivas, how much time do we have for this
10 minutes.
session? 10 minutes? Oh,
yeah.
So we'll have time perhaps for another question, Dr. Gopal, because here, you know that Sri Aurobindo was one of the leaders of the Congress nationalists, as they call themselves. The Congress moderates and the British called them the extremists, because they were extremists because simply they were demanding independence. Right from 1906, 1907, there were demands and more open and explicit under the pen of these, like Tilak, like Bipin Pal, Lala Lajpat Rai and others, for open calls for independence. And that made them extremists in the view of the Congress moderates and of course the British, but they call themselves nationalists. So nationalism was a very noble word in those days, and it simply meant, defending the truth of India and therefore achieving independence to embody that truth and to convey it to the world. And Sri Aurobindo never stopped saying those days that India does not want to achieve independence for her own sake. It's for the sake of the world, because her, what she has to give to the world has to be unshackled. So that is one thing. But about patriotism, there is something very important which he said, because I see, my friends in India using that word all the time, patriotism. We have to be patriotic. We forget two things, that, every nation has patriotism. Every nation is patriotic. But there's something wrong with patriotism. If you look at Nazi Germany under Hitler, they were extremely patriotic, the Germans. Hitler was the most patriotic person, perhaps, Deutschland über alles. So you cannot deny that, he revered his nation as something supreme. So Sri Aurobindo explained this very clearly at some point, I forget exactly where. He says there are two kinds of patriotism. The patriotism of the ego, the national ego, where you appeal to the national ego and it becomes a source of aggression over others. It becomes a kind of a danger to others and a source of, all the wars we have seen in human history. And he said the patriotism of India is of a different kind, is the patriotism of the soul. And where the foundation is not the national ego, there should not be actually a national ego, but the soul of the nation. And he said in that there is no danger. It can only be an enrichment. So therefore this word patriotism is tricky because it covers very different phenomena. And for him, the Indian version had nothing to do with the European version. So this is, in a nutshell, I think, what I can remember. Secularism was for him a perfectly irrelevant concept to the Indian context for two reasons. One, it's a European concept, and it was extremely useful in Europe from the 18th century onward, when the religious powers, especially the Christian Church, or in Turkey, the Caliphate, had to be separated from the political power. And there was all the revolutions in Europe were basically aiming at that, or partly aiming at that. And the result was that after the Age of Enlightenment and all the Enlightenment philosophers who actually undermined the foundations of Christianity, there was in the 18th and 19th century a big push to tell the churches and the Caliphate in Turkey, you stay back in your place. You have a place in the world of religion, not in the world of politics and not in the world of education. So that was secularism. And it was a very positive and needed development in Europe. In India, in Indian history, we never had a moment where there was a need to separate religion and politics, because we never had a ruler who imposed the religion on his or her, mostly his, subjects. Ashoka, for example, could have tried to impose Buddhism in his empire. He did exactly the opposite. He said we want all sects to prosper and to enrich themselves in mutual dialogue. If you take a Jain ruler like Kharavela, for example, he could have also, and he was a very staunch Jain king, he could have tried to impose Jainism. There was nothing of the kind, etc. So this concept of imposition of a belief system in India is something totally alien to the Indian ethos. So that's one reason why the whole debate about secularism is irrelevant. The second reason, which Romeo explains quite clearly, he says in a letter to a former collaborator, political collaborator in, I think, 1924, he says, to me, there is nothing secular. To me, there is nothing secular. All aspects of life have to be spiritualized. And he explains that this is actually the Hindu approach, that in the Hindu worldview, everything is sacred, everything is potentially divine, or we have to make it so. And therefore, whether it is nature, whether it is our daily life, whether it is, all aspects, whether it is knowledge, learning, education, whether it is even constructing a house, digging a well, everything is potentially a sacred activity where you will invoke the divinity and so on. So there's nothing secular. In fact, we should boldly assert, I don't know why people keep saying that Hinduism promotes secularism. Nothing of the kind. Hinduism promotes exactly the opposite attitude of spiritualizing life in all its aspects. So it is not secular. Why do we have to import these notions and try to fit our Indian culture into them? So this is in a nutshell what his answer was.
Srinivasa, do I have time for another question, or should we end this session?
Yeah, if Michel can give a short answer, you have time for one more question.
Then I will make it short.
Yeah. The last question is like, and I could talk about this the whole day, but how do you reconcile tradition and modernity in present India? Because we seem to be now kind of being pulled in two different directions, where we are having a very strong thread with the tradition and we are looking at modernity. So what is the best way, according to you, to kind of reconcile these two aspects?
If you look at Indian history, there was never a conflict. I mean, because there's always modernity at any given time in the past, right? That particular given time was modern then. So, of course, we have a different kind of modernity today, but there should not be a difficulty provided we don't forget the foundations. So this modernity is actually a very superficial, temporary phenomenon. Tomorrow's modernity will be still very different and nobody can predict what it will be like. So the problem is what do you want to found your life on? And if you go back to those core values of they are ancient, but they are not anti-modern. They can guide you all the more in this very, very difficult world we live in, which is fragmented, exploded all the time, where it is so easy to lose your orientation, get depressed, commit suicide. It's such a difficult, chaotic life we live. So it makes it all the more relevant to find our anchors, in those perennial values, and then the rest will follow automatically. There may be readjustments sometimes to be done, but this will be an individual question to answer ultimately. I'm keeping it brief, following Srinivasa's.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Sir, Michel Danino Sir. And I think we should conclude the session. I should thank Srinivas Sir and Harikaran Garu and Indica Academy for giving me this wonderful opportunity to be speaking to my idol here. And I hope a lot of people are inspired to go explore more of Aurobindo and explore more of Michel Danino's works. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gopal, for joining me here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gopal, for asking some really wonderful questions, very appropriate for the current times. I think we have a time for only one question. There were several questions asked by the audience, but I think one question probably you could take before we could get started with Vishal. So the question that I chose is, what does Aurobindo have to say about Hindu-Muslim coexistence?
So, yes, of course, it's always topical. Sri Aurobindo was very clear that Indian Muslims had a full place in the future Indian nation. His attempt was not to reject Muslims in any way, but he was also equally clear that Hindus were not to yield more space than necessary, or to compromise their beliefs, or to accept any form of subjections. And if there was going to be, you see, I'll be very brief. There was already this intense Hindu-Muslim conflict in the early freedom movement, of which Sri Aurobindo was a part. And there were riots, very frequent, which started in the late 19th century, and which were actually, warmly encouraged by the colonial powers because it suited their purpose. So this was very visible in Bengal, where he operated, and the seeds, this partition of Bengal in 1905 was one of the great triggers for the nationalist movement and the future independence movement. But there were two kinds of Muslims, and he addresses both of them. Those who were collaborating with the colonial authorities, like the Nawab of Dhaka in those days, and who actually wanted Muslims to recover their old dominance over this land. And there were other Muslims who did not want this partition and who did not have a problem coexisting with Hindus. And if you read Asim Majumdar, this was the time where both Muslims and Hindus were having processions in the streets of Calcutta chanting Bande Mataram. Muslims too, according to Asim Majumdar at least. So Sri Aurobindo addresses both, and what he says is that we must meet as equal brothers. And if Muslims are ready to accept us as equal brothers, then we can live in harmony. But it's for the Muslims to decide whether it will be, I'm paraphrasing one of his answers, whether it will be the embrace of the brothers or the embrace of wrestlers. This is what he says. But he says that Hindus are not the aggressors. This is not in their temperament, and we are not excluding. And he says he wants Muslims to be part of the future nation. So, but he's very clear that it should not be at the cost of any compromise. And he was quite upset when later he could see, the Congress moderates compromising on and giving concessions which were not, in his view, required. So that's another political question that is addressed in the book. I will not go into it now.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Danino. I think you answered it quite well without actually trying, getting into the politics of it. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Pingali Gopal.